you won't be aware at the moment that New Zealand is getting sold down the river at the United Nations currently. And it has been, and mainstream media have, to a large extent, ignored the fact that there are a series of what I would call cultural and commercial quislings who are going to the United Nations as I talk to you now and selling New Zealand down the river as being a racist, inward-looking, and frankly, despotic regime. Now, I know those sound extraordinary claims to make, but they're not my claims. They are claims made by leading Maori academics in New York as they attend various United Nations conferences connected to indigenous peoples. Two of the people that are leading this charge are people who have serious and well-remunerated positions in this world, the latter courtesy of the two I'm about to mention, of the New Zealand taxpayer. The first is National Iwi's Chairs Forum and former Chief Operating Officer of Hapai Te Hoora, Janelle Duschka. It was part of a delegation representing Maori at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York. And she condemned the coalition government at that forum for, quote unquote, now what I got this regarding Maori health and Indigenous health as a distraction. She was actually having a go at the coalition government for saying that cultural requirements shouldn't be mandatory for qualified professionals. And the National Party at the last election said, listen, if we want to attract qualified clinicians and health staff to our country, we need to be opening doors, for Pete's sake. We need them drastically and dramatically to do so. They really don't and shouldn't need to go through a whole series of cultural requirements to be able to practice, or before that they can have clinical care. Well, Duschka went to the United Nations and says the notion that cultural safety and tikanga Māori get in the way of clinical safety is a fallacious propaganda and goes against empirical evidence. This raises huge concern that patients, Māori patients in particular, will continue to be culturally unsafe and perpetuate not only racial discrimination, but a failure to treat the humanity of the person. And she took off to the United Nations to go and tell them that, courtesy, presumably, of the National Iwi Chairs Forum. Janelle Duschka. If you thought that was bad enough, then try Professor of Law at Auckland University, Claire Charters, a so-called expert in Indigenous rights and international and constitutional law. And she's told the United Nations in the same week that the New Zealand government is pushing the most regressive policies that she's ever seen. She's ever seen, all right? Now, the most regressive policies she's ever seen, ever. Now, you can compare the whole world. These are the most regressive policies ever. She goes on to say that New Zealand's policy on the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People sits alongside its legislative strategy to dismantle Maori rights in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which has received global attention for its regressiveness. And Charters also went to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and has asked for the United Nations to investigate New Zealand and send, in particular, a special rapporteur to visit New Zealand because, and citing Winston Peters and a series of others, the current government has expressly rejected, says Charters, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It is committed to not implementing the Declaration. And then she goes on to say she not only wants the rapporteur to come to New Zealand, but she wants the United Nations to impose the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, impose it upon New Zealand and use all the powers essentially at its command. Now, this is from Professor Claire Charters. Is it Charters? Yes, that's her. Who is a professor of law at Auckland University. And both these women, academically trained, intelligent, but funded agreeably by the New Zealand taxpayer, both for their education, for their status in society, for the ability to them to go to such an august organisation as the United Nations, are selling us down the river as a country. They are suggesting there is something wrong with our country, and they are inviting intervention from the United Nations to investigate us for apparently committing some form of cultural genocide and some form of significant racial discrimination against the indigenous folk who first discovered these climes, I think, start of the 13th century. It is, of course, a nonsense. It is, of course, a lie. It is, of course, a woeful and appalling misrepresentation of equality and democracy in this country. There is no rights being stripped from Maori in this country. They have the same rights, and one might argue in many cases more rights than ordinary New Zealanders when it comes to accessing government care, government monies, government services and government assistance. One might well argue that Maori in this country, and I think it's a very arguable and debatable point, actually have more rights than non-Maori in this country. But here we are, having leading academics and Maori leaders turn up at the United Nations, portraying us almost as if we are the south of the United States before the Civil War, that we are some form of antediluvian nation from the 19th century. Maybe the Belgian Congo would be another example, exploiting the indigenous folks for the benefit of superior white people, and also discriminating against those who, when the reality is exactly the opposite. Maori in this country are equal citizens, are able to take their part in the international as well as the national world. And how ironic that these two Maori leaders have gained their status directly as a consequence of existing within the so-called white settler colonial environment that they have been educated in, are now selling us down the river at the United Nations. Now, you won't get the mainstream media reporting on this. This background is being reported mostly by Te Ao Māori News. Again, another New Zealand taxpayer-funded news organisation, and really almost a propagandist for this sort of nonsense as well. But I raise that because it worries me that we are now appearing, and these people will continue to do this. They will not run away from this. They will continue to portray New Zealand as a racist, discriminatory regime, not a democratic nation that gives all equal rights, and some more rights than others, quite frankly, and they're not the white people, but then invites the intervention of another group, an august organisation, the United Nations, to come over here and review and interview us and get us to justify the democratic responsibilities and decisions that we've made, and then B, if it doesn't accord with their wishes, intervene directly and use all the powers at their command. Extraordinary. And frankly, almost traitorous, I'd have to say. If this is the nature of Maori activism, which is to run this country down in international fora and to seek the intervention of outside powers, then, and all done, I might add, with the aid and assistance of the New Zealand education system and significant government funding, there we are in a pretty pass indeed. Those are my thoughts this morning. What are yours?